Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can see and hear me okay. Wherever you might be joining us from, a very cold and crispy Leicestershire for me. It's a pleasure to come and speak to you today as part of CALRG. I've presented here a few times in the past, but it's great to be back as always. So as Beck mentioned, I'm Julia Sargent. I'm a lecturer in IET. And I've been at the OU for just over 5 years now. I don't know where that time's gone, but yeah, just over 5 years now. I currently work in the curriculum sort of development part of the unit. So I've been involved with various presentations and production of modules, qualifications and courses. And one of those is microcredentials, which I've been involved in as sort of standalone modules, but also part of things like the PG CAP and then more recently the Masters in Online Teaching. So I'll talk a little bit more about this shortly. But the main premise of my talk is to be a bit indulgent in thinking through a concept called entangled pedagogy, and then considering this for online contexts, as well as the merits and reflections of that for your own approaches. So I'm going to start my talk today by looking at the different contexts of online learning in which I tend to work. And you'll see that I've used quite a broad category to include online learning spaces, and I'll look at this throughout the talk today. I'll then do my very best to talk you through this notion of entangled pedagogy, which draws heavily on the work of Tim Fawns. And I'll then give some perspectives on this in terms of online learning and aspects such as agency and implications for you to perhaps think about in terms of your own research. So before I go any further, I just wanted to give you a bit of an oversight of my current journey of thoughts that I've called this in relation to this perspective. And I would say it's very much a journey that I'm still on. So whilst I work within the Institute of Educational Technology, and my work largely centres around the use of different educational technologies in different spaces, my journey started in the context of physical education and sport, and it's an area that I still work and research at this time. And a colleague and I last year published a paper somewhat breaking down the concept of TEL, so technology enhanced learning. And we looked at the different elements of pedagogy to consider what technologies and learning claims are currently being used within the field of physical education. And that led to some interesting discussions. And then we're then invited to write a book for this handbook, which we're currently finalising on. And we draw on some of the papers that were included in that journal piece. But we're engaging a bit more with the concept of entangled pedagogy. And then we're hoping to present this at an international conference next year to further develop that work. So it's a journey of thoughts that I hope will inspire some reflections in your own context as I think about it more broadly today. And I wanted to take this opportunity to try some of these ideas out in relation to online learning and micro-credentials to help develop this work, but also kind of my thinking around it. So a little bit of a dual focus today. So without further ado, I wanted to give you a bit of an oversight of the current online learning context that I work in. So I've worked with micro-credentials modules. Now these tend to be 15 credit courses for postgraduate learners. They're still hosted on FutureLearn at the moment. They generally tend to be about 12 weeks long, give or take, and they have one piece of assessment at the end of those 12 weeks. So that's kind of a few of the, I suppose, the key pointers or ways in which you could highlight the micro-credentials context. And then we have some qualifications as well. So the PG CAP and Liz, it's nice to see you here, compromises of only micro-credentials and then also awards HEA fellowship at the end. So I worked with that a bit last year. And then we've got HA80, which is a module that I'm also going to be working in next year. And as a result of completing that, one gets a postgraduate certificate in online teaching. And then we've got more recently the Masters in online teaching as well. And I'll talk a little bit about this coming up. And then we've got modules. So the first three of those on that list, the HZFMs, are micro-credentials that I've chaired. And then the last two modules I've also chaired, but they don't come under kind of the category of micro-credentials. But you could also see that there's some overlap in terms of, for example, HA80 being a module, but also the equivalent of a qualification. And similarly, the micro-credentials are part of the Masters in Online Teaching and also the PG Cap as well. So not to preempt some of my talk there, but there's some entanglement and I suppose natural overlap going on here. So with credit to Leanne for this slide, I'm going to focus on micro-credentials now. So these are the main ones that I kind of have worked with in various guises. And these are all part of the PG Cap and the Masters in Online Teaching, apart from the first one on that list. And the first one was made with rapid response sort of production in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. And you can see that they've got a similar flavour in terms of the online teaching, the teacher development part of them, and I suppose the educational focus to them. And as I mentioned before, we've got that similar format in terms of the credits, the postgraduate focus, the 12-week length. And then also to credit Liz for this slide. I also mentioned before that I worked with the PG Cap qualification for about a year. And I worked with a combination of several of these micro-credentials and an additional module 888. And this diagram just kind of gives you a bit of an overview of this qualification. So a total of 60 credits needed for this qualification. And it involves several what's termed core micro-credentials, so ones that everyone has to study, as well as an elective one, so an optional one. And I've also put to the right-hand side of this slide the Advanced HE and Future Learn, as these are two, I suppose you could use the broad category of like an external party that we work with. One which is accredits the scheme so that we can award fellowship, and the other being the hosting online platform for the qual. And I'm just highlighting it here because you'll see these kind of come into play later on in my talk. And then the other qualification that I mentioned was the Masters in Online Teaching. This is a new qualification delivered entirely online. And this slide from Leanne gives an overview of the whole qualification. But if we break it down into its different parts, so going from left to right, we have the first module, which is HA80, which also gives the postgraduate certificate in online teaching. And then one can choose 60 credits from micro-credentials, but then you could also draw on some of the other modules which are at the bottom, the EE modules from the Wells faculty as well. And then we have the final final module, sorry, H890, which I was part of authoring. And you can also study this as a standalone module, but studying the three elements in turn gains you the Masters in online teaching. And I think this is a really interesting combination of both 60 credit module, sorry, but also micro-credentials to give you this overall Masters program. And then as of February, as I mentioned, I'll be taking on the lead of the first module, which is part of the Masters, which is Technology Enhanced Learning, Foundations and Futures. And this is also currently on the Future Learn platform as an online provider. And the final slide in terms of online context relates somewhat to the PG CAP, but also Applaud, which I now work with. And Applaud stands for the Open University's institutional scheme, which accredits and promotes professional learning and academic development. And whilst PG CAP as a qualification is categorised as a taught route through to HEA fellowship, Applaud, on the other hand, is experiential and a supported route, which also gains HEA fellowship and recognition again with advanced HE. And I just put on this slide as well because I think it's kind of important to highlight that the PG CAP under the leadership of Liz was the first OU qualification to feature the stackable microcredentials as a sort of pilot. So a bit of a, I suppose, a trailblazer in the OU in terms of this combination of microcredentials. So bringing all of these online learning contexts together, I was thinking through perhaps what are some of the online learning commonalities, and I appreciate this is quite a broad term, but I was thinking through, okay, most of them involve social learning, so learning with other people, discussing ideas, reflecting through forums, adding comments and things on FutureLearn. And this also ties in with collaboration with other people, learning from others. They also involve, in the context in which I work with, learning at a distance. So very, very rarely will they involve any face-to-face work. And there is a combination of both asynchronous and synchronous support. And there is an end goal for the learners in terms of using these online learning contexts to achieve an end goal. So whether that's learning from the course, taking that back into their own workplace, whether that's gaining credit or a qualification or something, there's some sort of end goal involved for them. But working across all these contexts has made me think about several questions in terms of looking at online learning, the process of learning, and whether that's in or through an online context, or whether it's the format of the learning material. So how do we tend to categorize it? Because the learning itself can take place in a huge variety of ways. So it takes place through collaboration, discussion, and this could also be in offline and online spaces. And similarly, how do we or do you tend to categorize what is and is not online learning? So where are its boundaries, and what role do people and technology play in this? And furthermore, whilst there are, I suppose, commonalities across these contexts, they also have different purposes, different values, and they're experienced in different ways by the learners that studied them. And this is not just in terms of how or why they're studied, but also the different parties that are involved in these. So also taking an educator perspective, I suppose, in the way in these courses are constructed and designed, we also tend to refer to online pedagogy as well. And I'm drawing upon Martin Weller's recent work here in terms of metaphors of EdTech. And if you hadn't had a look at it, I would recommend going and having a look at it. But online pedagogies are often couched in terms of metaphors because they help to frame how people operate in what can be an unfamiliar environment. And entangled pedagogy, which I'm now going to look at, this is a perspective that is also couched in terms of metaphors as a starting point. And this is something that I wanted to start with, as sometimes, and not always, they help to frame the understanding of an approach, particularly if you've not come across it before. So, a classic metaphor around education and what can serve as some of the basis of Tim Thorne's approach to entangled pedagogy is one in relation to pedagogy and technology. And that being pedagogy, so things like our teaching, our approaches to learning, and the argument that it must come before the technology that we're using. So, if we take this in relation to metaphors, you may or may not have come across the metaphor of the pedagogical horse being able to drive the technological cart. Um, and also the criticism that tends to be presented that we tend to see the technological cart as driving the pedagogical horse. And if we look at that more broadly, essentially the argument is that we're putting technology and the technologies that we're using before our teaching and the learning that's involved. And something that doesn't always really work if you're thinking about in terms of the metaphor of the horse and the cart. And Dron and Anderson also use a metaphor of a dance in relation to pedagogy and technology. So the metaphor around this is that pedagogy and technology are in essence dancing together. So neither one of them is driving the other. They are immersed together in this dance. And Anderson and Dron talk about the metaphor of the dance, in which they argue that technology sets the beat and creates the music, while the pedagogy defines the moves. Now, if you were to break this metaphor down a little bit, you might critique the idea of there being a lead dancer or someone who, in essence, is driving that, particularly for those of you who are a fan of Strictly Come Dancing. But Thorne's argument in relation to entangled pedagogy is that technology is part of pedagogy. Pedagogy is this kind of broader element, and technology is involved with dancing, with methods, with different values that we have, and the context in which they work in. Now, in the entangled model that I'm going to go and then talk about, the argument is that pedagogy is the dance itself. So if we think about this in terms of agency, and connecting to this idea of metaphors, a teacher or an educator might lead the choreography of the dance, but they only have limited control over how the dance actually plays out. And this is quite useful, as you can see, in the physical education context in which I've worked in before. Now, these might be a little bit confusing or might not work for you in terms of breaking down the start of this concept. So luckily, Thorne's has sought to break this down much further to consider what these individual parts mean. And I'm going to talk about this in turn next. So column 1 in this kind of overview of entangled pedagogy represents a technology first point of view. And in this point of view, technology, in whatever context we're using, is seen as the driver of educational activity and the outcomes that we produce. And the argument with this point of view is that the skill is with the teachers in choosing the right tools and using them correctly. In which case the tool, so the technology, predicts the outcome. So the argument in this case is if you choose the right tool, you will get the outcome that you want. And this is an example of bringing a technology in to solve an educational problem. And this is sometimes called technological determinism, in the sense that technology is seen as the driver and the determinant of change. And if we think about this in terms of agency and the metaphors that I just talked about, this links to that idea that teachers may lead a piece of choreography, but they only have limited control about how the dance then plays out. And Horns discusses this as either an essentialist view in that technology can embody different pedagogical principles. So Fawns uses the example of learning analytics in suggesting that using different analytical tools and technologies, and the argument that personalized learning can be achieved as a result of using those different technologies. But technology can also be seen as neutral in that it can be used to enhance or make more efficient a teaching process. And common phrases in relation to this that you may have come across in terms of this essentialist view is that technology has inherently in itself certain principles such as enhancement, effectiveness, and efficiency. So that's kind of the first part, the first column. And then in response to this sort of worry that technology is driving pedagogy, our teaching, there is also the flip side in having a pedagogy first perspective, which is also referred to as a type of pedagogical determinism. And column 2, as well as column 1, are presented as this illusion because they promote the endorsement that there's a pedagogy first perspective or a human led approach. So educators are seen as the drivers of change. And more subtle indicators of this pedagogy first view give references to things like tools. So you might have heard of the phrase, it's not the tool, it's how you use it. But also Fawns argues that technology enhanced learning is a kind of characteristic of this pedagogy first view. And this idea of enhancement can reassure you that technology will only make better what is already good. So it implies that it has control over sort of a more of a linear idea of learning. And the argument in this point of view is that teachers can use whatever technologies are available to achieve their objectives and enact their particular pedagogical approach that they're choosing. So they have lots of agency in this regard. And the skill of the educator is seen as choosing the right methods, so the right pedagogies, and using the tools to support them. And Fawns argues that he's sympathetic to this idea, but that worried that it doesn't quite work like that. It doesn't quite play out like this in educational contexts. So he came up with this idea of entangled pedagogy, of which I'm now going to break down further. Now, in this column, entangled pedagogy is considered to be enacted and tend to present what is actually happening in most educational contexts. And returning to the first two columns, they are classified as that illusion because you always have this mutual shaping of different elements in play. So Fawns believes that technology can't drive pedagogy because they are already entrenched methods in the particular context in which we're working in. So there are people there, there's pedagogy already there. But he also says that pedagogy can't drive technology because there are already technology infrastructures in place that influence it and take play already. So an educator can't steamroller either technology or pedagogy into a context. So column 3 takes the perspective that there's a mutual shaping of multiple purposes, multiple contexts, multiple values, methods involved. And the skill of the educator is in relation to this configuration, design. He also uses the terms orchestration of all of these different elements. And in this view, technology is not viewed as one particular thing. So we don't have an iPad, a system, a program. It's very much seen as multiple views. It's contextual and it's relational. And if you think about this in terms of our practice, we often use lots of different technologies. So a discussion forum, an online space. We don't tend to use one particular piece of technology. We sort of assemble them together. An agency in this sense is seen as negotiated between the different elements that are a part of the context. So this can include aspects such as teachers, technology, students, policy, infrastructure, etc. And if we relate this to some of the examples that I talked about towards the start of this presentation, this would include aspects such as advanced HE, future learn, and perhaps other people that we're working with as part of that stakeholder base. And the educational outcome that we're trying to achieve is contingent on a complex relationship between all these elements. And in essence, they are somewhat entangled. Now, the final column on this table is Faunce's aspirational view of how teachers, students, and other stakeholders can engage with this emergent complexity of educational activity. And this view recognises that methods and technology they tend to become overemphasised in educational discourse, in design and practice. And it suggests a need to intentionally and regularly revisit the purposes, values, and context that we're involved in to ensure that they are meaningfully and iteratively form choices around methods and technology. So they recognise the shaping of technology and methods as part of this educational mix. And the argument is that we should try to revisit the first part of this column as much as possible. So that is the purpose, the context, and the values of the educational scenario in which we're working with. And this approach means that teachers and students should collaborate on design and practice of educational context. There's a lot of uncertainty and I suppose imperfection, which is embraced in Faunce's view alongside openness and honesty. And this gives me the view that outcomes as well are not necessarily decided upon from the outset, or that there's an appreciation that they change in the entanglement of all these other areas. And the eagle-eyed amongst you would have noticed as well that the last column at the bottom also shifts from a perspective from skills to knowledge. So this is in terms of knowledge being distributed, responsive and ethical. And from what I can see, Faunce doesn't really tend to elaborate much on why this is a shift. But I think it's quite an interesting thing that I'm engaging with in terms of moving from this idea of skills to enacting knowledge. So returning back to Faunce's main paper, I wanted to see if there was anything more explicit in relation to online learning or online pedagogy, so to speak. And I'm giving no excuses for the festive picture in this slide. So Faunce talks about online learning being an example of that first column in that diagram, so the technology first point of view. But he says it's only represented in that column when it's talked about in terms of universal qualities or impacts that are attributed specifically to online learning. So an example of this would be, for example, if we use online learning, that's going to make us more open. That's going to make learning more personalized. So it's specifically attributed one thing to another. And he also talked about during the COVID-19 pandemic, there were instances of what was termed emergency remote teaching. So fortunately, not so much in relation to the OU, but certainly in other face-to-face contexts. And this is one example of whereby there are attempts to reinforce practices that would have often been unsuitable to different contexts. Therefore, returning to the perspective of looking at the purposes, the values and contexts that we're working in above others. And Faunce's final perspective, directly attributed to online contexts, is that there's a tendency to describe digital learning environments, so particularly online or hybrid ones, as independent of their social and material contexts. So while there might be differences between different methods of teaching, those labels are insufficient representations of the interplay of elements going on. And taking all of those aspects into account, I wanted to highlight this particular quote from the paper, which I think summarizes entangled pedagogy quite nicely. So it talks about the idea that taking an entangled pedagogy perspective and using this model is agnostic about modality, because the relationship of technology to the situated combination of contexts, purposes, and values and methods is seen as more important. And for me, this is really interesting in the context of the Open University, as our current structure is normally online and distance learning by design. So in thinking through this presentation, I was thinking, well, perhaps at the OU, we're actually already doing a good job of entangled pedagogy, particularly in the context that I'm working with. So I then thought, okay, how can I then seek to engage with this approach and think about it within the context of a microcredential example? So I wanted to spend the next couple of slides just looking through an example of entangled pedagogy. So taking you through this kind of approach in the context of a microcredential. And obviously this is sort of my point of view, and you may again have other different ways of looking at your own context. And this is one way in which I see entangled pedagogy being applied and I suppose enacted or reflected upon. So if we take a look at technology, first of all, we have the use of online platforms. So in this case, it's FutureLearn, which holds particular ways of operating and presenting courses such as microcredentials. It also uses discussion forums. So we have comment boxes for learners to discuss course materials. And this is also used by the study advisors to support and engage in that dialogue with learners. In the context of microcredentials, it's also all asynchronous. So there are no live tutorial sessions. All the collaboration occurs in this online space. And in terms of methods, given this entanglement with FutureLearn, there's also the use of social learning pedagogy, so that we learn with each other, that we come together to support each other's learning. And there is very much, I suppose, in relation to other OU courses, a light touch approach to student support and facilitating learning. And as I've mentioned, this all occurs through the written online forums. There is only one piece of assessment at the end of the 12 weeks of material. So this is, I suppose, what you could call like a single shot, so to speak, for learners to pass the module and to gain the credit at the end. And if we look at purposes, values, and context next, in terms of microcredentials, they are very much focused in terms of developing practical skills that learners can take back into the workplace and apply in their own context. And drawing on Biesta's terms of socialization as a particular idea of an educational purpose, learners engage with each other and they hear the views of other people. And the purpose in this regard is that they are encouraged to reflect upon their views and the engagement with other people. And subjectification, it's quite a loaded term, but relates to the sense of the purpose of trying to prepare learners to be autonomous and independent in their learning through critical thinking. And of course, there are the perspectives of the designers as well. So when I look at the different contexts, you can also see how they are entangled with the learner's context, and I'll talk about this in a second. So turning to values next, there is a focus on collaboration and supporting each other. This involves critical thinking, reflection, and I suppose what I've kind of termed healthy debate. And we encourage on the micro credentials to respect each other's views and being careful about the views in which you present and that you share something with other people. So I would say this is a value that we do promote within the micro credentials and that we seek to uphold, is that kind of respect and I suppose healthy debate with other people. Now, the context on this slide is more in relation, I suppose, to the learner's context in which they are often studying on alongside full-time work, which means that they've got quite a lot going on. It's quite time intensive for them. And we know from some of the evaluation work, so nice to see you, Kathy, and some of the broader micro-credentials work that's been done at the OU, that for some of these learners, credit, so completing the module, finishing that assessment, passing it, is not actually what they are after. They are sometimes after learning the content, those practical skills, and taking that back into the workplace rather than necessarily gaining that credit. And we also have the context in which the OU is currently on FutureLearn and using this platform. So this means that there are several contexts in relation to things like student support and registration. That means that this particular context influences the student study experience that they have here. So returning to this kind of entanglement, there is a huge amount of relationships and interwoven aspects that are interacting in this space. And one example is in relation to people and agency. So, for example, with micro-credentials, we have a chair who takes the micro-credential through the awards process, etc. And then we also have study advisors, which play a similar role to a sort of a mentor or a tutor, who support the learners in the day-to-day queries and support on the course. So this is an example in a particular in relation to micro-credentials, where there's that entangled knowledge and agency of the different people that are involved there. And for this example, there are different people and that negotiation between those different aspects. And for other people and for you in different contexts, this might be, say, between a teacher and a particular group of learners. And I wanted to end this section in relation to the notion of knowledge and the entangled pedagogy perspective, focusing on knowledge as distributed, responsive, and ethical. And Fawns uses the phrase in his paper of ethics requiring more than a linear chain of events. It means tracing relations to see where they lead. So crudely focusing in on technologies, he talks about the use of things like plagiarism detective software, so things like Turnitin, for example, and what knowledge and ethics this has between the classic teacher role and the student. And although he doesn't talk about this in this paper, we have the generative AI debates that are still spinning around. And when I was thinking through this paper and considering these technologies, it kind of relates to some of those ongoing discussions that we're having. So what might the use of these technologies lead to? Whose agency is impacted? And how do the use of these technologies relate to our purposes, values, and context? So that's something I think is important for us to ponder on and continue to ponder on. So I wanted to end this talk on some ideas taken from this work, but also things that I've considered from my thoughts journey, I suppose, in relation to entangled pedagogy for research and for scholarship. So I think we do quite a good job at the OU of this in seeking to look past modality and to contextualize what this means for our learners. So choosing the best approach to suit them rather than trying to sort of steamroller or shoehorn something into our context. And particularly when we think about research and scholarship, is looking at a combination of different factors rather than individual components. So thinking about this in practical terms is rather than just looking at a particular teaching approach, or rather than just looking at a particular piece of technology, is we seek to look at the combination of these areas and the different stakeholders involved. And looking at that entangled model, you can see that I've been talking today about the purposes, the values, and context, and keep revisiting them. But the idea is that these are emphasized and continually revisited during the design process. And a lot of the processes that we tend to do at the OU in terms of learning design, I suppose, is a part of this involvement of purposes, values, and contexts. But I think it's important that we don't just do this at the start. It's something that we revisit in terms of how we update and progress these courses. So it's a starting point in the design journey, but it's not necessarily the end. And then we've got this collaboration between different parties. So that could be something like Advanced HE, it could be something like FutureLearn, but then we've also got different stakeholders, we've got different students, we've got different people, whether that's a chair, a study advisor, etc., involved. So we've got all this collaboration that I think is really important that we continue to engage with and acknowledge in that kind of entangled process. So just to return to what I set out to do in this talk, and thanks for bearing with me today, is I looked at some of the different contexts of online learning in which I've been involved with, and I tried somewhat to engage with this idea of entangled pedagogy to consider what it means kind of for me and how I'm understanding it, but also how it might relate to some of your own context and your own thinking. And then I've then presented a few ideas for considering implications for research and for scholarship. So that is the end of my talk. I wanted to thank you very much for listening, and looking forward to discuss with you.